The halls of Windsor Castle have witnessed centuries of calculated political maneuvers, hidden alliances, and quiet downfalls, but few events have sent shockwaves through the royal institution, quite like the recent confrontation between Prince Edward and Queen Camilla over the fate of Windsor Lodge. For decades, observers of the British royal family have categorized individuals into rigid archetypes, labeling some as ruthless power players and others as passive bystanders who merely occupy space within the grand lineage. Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, had long been relegated to the latter category by palace insiders and the sensationalist press alike. He was viewed as the mild-mannered youngest brother, a man who preferred the quiet solitude of his private duties, a royal who actively chose to stay out of the fierce conflicts that frequently tore his siblings apart. This quiet demeanor, however, was tragically misinterpreted by those who mistook patience for weakness and composure for a lack of resolve. The reality of the situation within the palace walls was vastly different, as the world would soon discover that there is a profound difference between a man who cannot fight and a man who simply chooses not to until the absolute perfect moment demands it. The turning point that shattered decades of palace equilibrium occurred during a formal, highly publicized Windsor Heritage Memorial event, a ceremony meant to honor royal ancestors and long-standing traditions. The room was packed with dignitaries, foreign officials, and hundreds of cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every modern detail of the historic gathering. Lady Louise Windsor, the 20-year-old daughter of Prince Edward and Princess Sophie, walked gracefully toward her assigned seat in the front rows, wearing an elegant black dress with her hair neatly pulled back, embodying the exact image of a dedicated granddaughter focused entirely on her duty. She was not there to seek attention, nor had she ever positioned herself as an ambitious figure angling for a higher status or public acclaim. She was simply showing up because her family asked her to. Yet, just as Louise was a few short steps away from the chairs, a senior courtier loyal to Queen Camilla's rising faction stepped forward directly in front of the assembled guests and the media lenses. With chilling deliberation, this courtier reached down, lifted the heavy bronze nameplate with Lady Louise Windsor's name deeply engraved into its surface, and dropped it without a single shred of hesitation into a wicker trash bin resting in the corner of the room. The sharp, metallic clank of the bronze hitting the bottom of the bin was instantly replaced by the smooth placement of a new nameplate representing a prominent member of Camilla's own personal circle. Louise stood entirely frozen in the aisle, forced to witness her own name and legacy literally thrown away like garbage, while whispers began to ripple through the rows of guests behind her. At just 20 years old, she was subjected to a calculated public humiliation, standing completely isolated under the glare of the flashing cameras. To make the cruelty of the moment even more profound, Queen Camilla swept past her seconds later, offering a cold, superficial smile for the reporters before leaning in to whisper a devastating line, telling the young woman that royal life requires knowing when to step back. It was a threat wrapped perfectly in the guise of traditional etiquette, designed to remind Louise that her standing in the family was conditional and easily erased. Rather than creating a scene or disrupting a solemn memorial, Louise quietly stepped back into the shadows, displaying a level of dignity and restraint that spoke volumes about her true character. Watching this entire insult unfold from the opposite row of seats was her father, Prince Edward, whose quiet exterior masked a rising storm of absolute resolve. That very evening, the quiet brother that everyone had dismissed for decades walked into his private study at Windsor Castle, closed the heavy oak doors, and began to unleash a meticulously prepared legal retaliation that would fundamentally alter the power structure of the estate. Edward did not engage in loud arguments, nor did he leak angry stories to the press. Instead, he weaponized old-school royal protocol and historical legal mechanisms against a queen who believed she was entirely untouchable. He drafted a binding, secretly sealed covenant that effectively stripped Queen Camilla of all her residency rights at Windsor Lodge, permanently transferring the entire legal ownership and administrative control directly to his daughter, Lady Louise. To ensure the gravity of this move was undeniable, Edward melted thick red wax and pressed his personal signet ring firmly into the document, a traditional administrative act that signaled an official, irrevocable decree. The following morning, when King Charles III discovered the document sitting on his desk, he was reportedly left completely frozen in his chair, staring at his brother's red wax seal because he instantly understood the brilliant legal trap that had been laid. The covenant was airtight, structured in such a manner that Charles could not issue any sovereign decree to reverse it or protect his wife without directly violating the sacred, final constitutional wishes of the late Queen Elizabeth II. For years, Camilla had viewed Windsor Lodge as the ultimate physical manifestation of her dominance and permanence within the royal hierarchy, a trophy showcasing her successful takeover of the inner circle. Edward's silent strike proved that her permanence was entirely conditional, demonstrating that while she had been busy playing public relations games, he had been quietly studying centuries-old property laws, procedural guidelines, and historical precedents. The depth of Edward's calculation went far beyond a father simply reacting to an insult. It was a masterclass in institutional warfare, executed by a man who had spent his entire life memorizing every lever of power that could be pulled when the survival of his family's honor hung in the balance. Following the silent activation of the sealed covenant, the psychological atmosphere inside the royal residences shifted dramatically as the hidden layers of Prince Edward's counter-strategy began to unfold with absolute structural precision. Edward understood that in the high-stakes theater of palace politics, a single legal document, no matter how airtight, could still be subjected to intense bureaucratic resistance if it lacked a deeper, unassailable historical legitimacy. To ensure that his moves were completely beyond the reach of any modern counterattack or public relations spin from Queen Camilla's allies, Edward embarked on a secret campaign to uncover the foundational truths buried deep within the crown's private history. Late at night, while the rest of the palace slept, the Duke of Edinburgh bypassed the standard administrative offices and descended into the family's most restricted ancestral archives beneath the ancient stone foundations of Windsor. Guided only by the narrow beam of a flashlight, he navigated through dust-covered corridors lined with centuries-old oak cabinets, searching for specific historical estate trusts that modern courtiers had long forgotten or intentionally ignored. What he discovered after hours of meticulous searching was a leather-bound ledger dating back to the year 1701, containing the original, ironclad iron-safe documents of the Windsor estate trusts. Embedded within these ancient pages was a specific, forgotten legal clause explicitly stating that the property and residency rights of major Windsor estates would automatically transfer to the children of the direct sovereign line if the reigning monarch chose to marry a divorced woman. This historical framework provided an immediate, undeniable layer of constitutional legitimacy to Edward's actions, creating an ancient legal shield that modern palace attorneys could not dismantle without questioning the entire legal foundation of the royal estate system itself. But the most emotionally devastating discovery lay directly beneath that ancient text, where Edward found a handwritten directive penned by his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, during the final years of her historic reign. In her unmistakable, precise handwriting, the late monarch had reinforced the preservation of Windsor Lodge, explicitly noting that the residence must always be utilized for what she termed service, without ambition. This profound phrase was a direct, prophetic indictment of the exact territorial expansions and private motives that Queen Camilla had been quietly orchestrating behind closed doors. Standing alone in the cold archive with the ancient ledger open before him, Edward realized that his mother had anticipated this exact type of institutional overreach and had left behind the precise intellectual weapons necessary to protect the integrity of the family name. The urgency of his intervention became even more terrifyingly clear when Edward discovered an active, highly confidential dossier sitting inside the current iron safe of the Windsor Estate Office, bearing the private seal of the Queen's administrative staff. Inside this secret file were comprehensive, fully drawn renovation blueprints for Windsor Lodge that had been commissioned by Camilla's inner circle months prior, completely hidden from the rest of the family. The detailed plans outlined a complete territorial takeover of the property, aiming to transform Windsor Lodge into a permanent, legally recognized private residence for Tom and Laura, Camilla's children from her previous marriage, alongside her grandchildren during major state occasions. The specific detail that caused Edward's resolve to harden into absolute steel was a structural blueprint showing that Lady Louise's personal memorial and duty room was scheduled to be completely demolished to make way for a modern gaming and entertainment suite for Camilla's non-royal bloodline. This was not a routine disagreement over palace logistics. It was a systematic attempt to erase the physical presence and legacy of those who carried the true Windsor name from their own ancestral ground. Armed with this undeniable proof of structural greed, Edward was prepared when Camilla, realizing her archive movements had been detected, summoned him to a fierce face-to-face confrontation inside the main office of Windsor Lodge. Sitting with engineered authority behind a massive, polished mahogany desk, Camilla attempted to use her standard methods of psychological intimidation, casually twirling the heavy bronze key of the residence on her finger as a display of total possession. She aggressively accused Edward of being an institutional traitor, claiming he was actively trying to tarnish her public honor and sow irreversible division within the core of the monarchy. She delivered a calculated ultimatum, threatening to weaponize her extensive network of media contacts to completely isolate Edward's family, ensure their systematic removal from future public events, and damage their standing if he did not immediately withdraw the sealed covenant. She assumed that because Edward had spent decades maintaining a polite, non-confrontational demeanor, he would naturally capitulate under the immense weight of royal status and media threats. But Edward did not raise his voice, nor did he offer a defensive explanation. Instead, he reached calmly into his formal coat pocket, pulled out the stolen copy of her secret renovation blueprints, and dropped them directly onto the polished mahogany desk, instantly stopping the rotation of the bronze key. In a low, steady, and commanding tone that completely altered the power dynamic in the room, Edward systematically walked her through every page of the documents, exposing the hidden timelines, the unauthorized architectural changes, and the explicit plans to bulldoze his daughter's room for a private entertainment suite. As the undeniable reality of her exposed schemes lay bare on the desk between them, Camilla's calculated composure completely shattered, her face turning from a pale shock to a deep, flushed crimson as she realized that her secret leverage had been completely turned into the very evidence that would convict her of institutional overreach. With Queen Camilla's secret blueprints exposed on the mahogany desk, the final phase of this royal counter-strategy expanded beyond a personal dispute into a coordinated effort to restore the ultimate structural honor of the monarchy. Princess Anne, who had long observed the steady expansion of Camilla's inner faction with deep institutional concern, entered the conflict with decisive, unyielding authority. Upon receiving the undeniable evidence compiled by Prince Edward, including the ancient trust documents from 1701 and the unauthorized renovation schedules, the Princess Royal chose to bypass all standard committee meetings and bureaucratic delays. She traveled directly to the Sovereign Estate Management headquarters and executed an official family confirmation order, formally certifying that Lady Louise Windsor completely met and exceeded all requirements of a loyal royal patron under the precise operational standards originally established by Queen Elizabeth II. This tactical movement completely trapped Camilla's position, creating a massive pincer movement where Edward's airtight legal covenant dismantled her claims from a constitutional standpoint, while Anne's formal intervention stripped her of any remaining family authority. King Charles III found himself in an entirely impossible and agonizing position, isolated within his private study at Buckingham Palace, with his head resting heavily in his hands. On one side of his desk lay the historical weight of the 1701 Trust Covenant, and on the other lay Princess Anne's certified confirmation decree. He was caught completely between his loyalty to his wife and his sacred obligation to uphold the constitutional legacy of his late mother. When Camilla entered his study in a state of high emotional distress, demanding an immediate sovereign decree to dissolve the covenant, punish Edward, and strip Louise of her status, the king was forced to deliver the final, devastating truth. His sovereign authority to protect her interests in this property matter had been completely frozen by the rigid terms of the historical trust, and any attempt to forcefully shred the document would trigger an unprecedented constitutional crisis that would permanently damage the public integrity of the House of Windsor. The physical enforcement of the eviction covenant commenced exactly at 2 o'clock on a crisp, sunlit afternoon at the Windsor grounds, unfolding with a cold, cinematic finality. A convoy of official estate vehicles carrying the senior management team arrived at the perimeter, executing their directives with solemn, expressionless faces. The legal activation of Edward's covenant immediately cancelled the entire staff schedule that Camilla had personally approved, instructing her trusted attendants that they no longer possessed any administrative authority or right of entry within the borders of Windsor Lodge. Simultaneously, security technicians moved systematically to the main electronic control systems, permanently erasing the access codes used by Camilla's network and implementing an encrypted security framework to which only Prince Edward and Lady Louise held the master keys. Princess Sophie stood silently on the main porch, watching the complete dismantling of the unlawful occupation with the quiet, resolute strength of a mother who had successfully reclaimed justice for her daughter. As the twilight shadows began to lengthen across the ancient trees of Windsor Park, Camilla's senior courtier, the very man who had confidently thrown Louise's bronze nameplate into the trash during the memorial event, walked towards Sophie with a pale face and slumped shoulders. He held a silver platter containing the heavy bronze key of the residence, forced by protocol to bow as low as possible in a state of complete public humiliation. Sophie quietly lifted the metal key, its soft clink against the silver surface marking the absolute and permanent end of Camilla's presence at Windsor Lodge. Although the Palace Communications Department attempted to issue a softened statement framing the transition as a routine administrative adjustment of family assets, the British press immediately exposed the true depth of the scandal. The next morning, major national newspapers released front-page features showcasing an exclusive, high-contrast photograph of Camilla bowing her head in profound shame as she fled the estate, accompanied by headlines confirming that Edward had successfully stripped the property from her control. Public outrage erupted immediately across the country, particularly among citizens who viewed the initial treatment of Lady Louise as an unacceptable display of institutional bullying. The long avenue leading toward Windsor Castle was quickly transformed into a moving sea of white roses, carried by thousands of citizens standing in quiet solidarity with Louise under banners declaring that the silent members of the family deserved to inherit their rightful legacy too. From behind the drawn curtains of her isolated quarters, Camilla was forced to listen to the distant chants of the crowd, staring at her own exposed countenance on the front pages, realizing that no machinery of public relations could salvage her moral standing from such total condemnation. Yet, the final stroke that rendered Louise's victory absolute was not an act of petty revenge, but a display of profound selflessness that completely altered the moral landscape of the entire conflict. Upon receiving the historic bronze key from her father, Lady Louise chose not to occupy Windsor Lodge as a personal trophy of victory, nor did she use it to further isolate her defeated detractors. Instead, she issued an official public communiqué announcing that the entire estate would be permanently converted into a dedicated retreat for the children of military families who had sacrificed for the realm, alongside serving as the permanent operational headquarters for carriage-driving charities. By transforming an elite piece of royal property into an instrument of pure public service, Louise elevated the conflict entirely out of the reach of palace politics. Camilla could not mount a counterattack or resist the transition, because it is structurally impossible to fight an opponent who demands nothing for themselves and gives the prize away to veterans, children, and charities. The property Camilla had secretly schemed to secure for her private non-royal lineage was now permanently dedicated to individuals with whom she had no connection, rendering her original ambitions entirely irrelevant. On a quiet, concluding afternoon, Camilla made one final, solitary visit to the vacated offices of the lodge to collect her remaining personal effects, her countenance completely stripped of its former authority. With trembling hands, she lifted her last sentimental keepsake from the desk and stepped out onto the main awning, where Lady Louise stood waiting in the shadows. Without a single word spoken between them, the Queen slowly extended her hand, surrendered the final remaining key of the estate to the young woman, and walked away into the descending twilight. The enduring lesson that settled permanently over the House of Windsor was both brutal and necessary. The future of the royal lineage would never belong to those driven by private ambition and territorial greed, but would eternally remain anchored by the silent, dedicated individuals who are ready to serve the realm with the fewest expectations, preserving true honor not through the loudest voice, but through the quietest integrity.